and the assistance we got, we were the second, if you look at the rank of countries, in terms of our debt forgiveness vis-a-vis our gross domestic product. Yet, just a few years down that road, we went begging the IMF again. Almost every 4 to 6 years, we go back to the IMF. Are we justified, or are we just led by mismanagers? What is your take?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the truth of the matter, and I think Dr. Abu Zakara said it, it's time for us to begin to speak the truth to ourselves. That, to be honest with you, since the 1960s, since the overthrow of President Kwame Nkrumah, I think we have had very bad governance, and I'm worried about that. I'm not even much concerned about our generation and our time. Many of us are getting old. But I'm concerned about our children and grandchildren, and we don't seem to be doing anything serious that will give them hope. Many people talk to me, in fact, in the last 2 years since the crisis began. I've had students, I teach in the university, asking whether there's hope in Ghana. And everybody wants to leave the country. Many people I've spoken to. People are already trying to get Canadian citizenship and other things. Doctors and professionals are leaving. I have many colleagues who refuse to come back to Ghana when I made a choice to come. So, I don't think it's good. Much of our politics has been irrational and capricious and corruption and mismanagement. And I think that's what has brought us here. And that's the truth of the matter. And you can trace back. So if you go back to 1960, Ghana was better off than Malaysia and South Korea, for example, or at par in terms of GDP per capita. And see where Malaysia and South Korea are now. Okay, Malaysia is an upper middle income country. GDP per capita is close to $12,000 per capita. They are aiming by 2030 to be a high income country. South Korea is already a high income country. And GDP per capita is above $30,000. Okay, and Ghana, we are still GDP per capita less than $2,500. And over the last 65 years, the things Malaysia has done, the things South Korea has done, in terms of macroeconomic management, industrialization, infrastructure, we have come nowhere near that. So we need to question ourselves, what kind of people are we voting into power? And what are the checks and balances? And sometimes I blame we, the voters, as we are part of it. We are talking about elections, this democracy. It has failed. We are talking about...
Are you suggesting our brand of democracy has failed, or democracy in itself is not out? I mean, let's get into the conversation of whether democracy is even good for us. And I know this is a tricky conversation. Democracy vis-a-vis what other things may exist. Rwanda, Singapore may come to mind. But is democracy working for us? Is it the way to go in Ghana?
It's the way to go, but it's not working at the moment because the institutions have failed. You know, when Obama came here, he said, what Africa needs is strong institutions. You know, a book that was written by some of the economists, Asimeglu and co. So institutions. So we need to look at all our economic institutions, our governance institutions, start from the central bank, come to the parliament, come to the Council of State, come to the fiscal institution, Minister of Finance, and look at all our institutions, look at our state-owned enterprises, and see whether they are performing. And look at even civil society organizations, whether they are checking government. Look at the special prosecutor. Look at all of that, judiciary. Are they doing what they're supposed to do? You see, if you look at our constitution, under the directive principles of state policy, economic objective, section 36, the state shall take all necessary action to ensure that the national economy is managed in such a manner has to maximize the rate of economic development and to secure the maximum welfare, freedom, and happiness of every person in Ghana, and to provide adequate means of livelihood and sustainable employment and public assistance to the needy. Are we doing that? We have a state over the last 65 years that maximize the rate of economic development and secure maximum welfare and freedom and happiness of every person. We have youth unemployment is about 33%. Every 10 youth you see, almost 4 of them are unemployed. I have graduate students with first class who have graduated from economics, business administration, 5-7 years, no job.
And even for those who get work, there is underemployment. In other words, the person studied something, but what they are having to do is very far from what they studied.
So we need to ask our question, over these last 65 years, are we even following the Constitution? That how do we hold government, the state, accountable to raise enough resources domestically and even to borrow prudentially, externally, that they invest in the economy to give hope to our children, our grandchildren, so that they can have hope. You cannot have a situation like that where people are easily going to government. I have, university professors now are getting into politics. People have just realized that if you want to make it in Ghana, you must join them. Okay, so because even if you're a university professor, the state is not ensuring that it's paying you adequately or even giving research. See, I've been a researcher and a lecturer in the University of Ghana since 2007. Ask over the last 15, 16 years, how much has the state given me to conduct research? Almost every research I've conducted has to be funded by international donors. I have to write a research proposal and get grant from foreign government. The government give research grant, or what they call book and research allowance, less than $2,000 a year for research for professors in the university, public university. What are they going to do with that? Even the research that is conducted is never used. So I think that we have a fundamental problem, and I think there's a political economy problem. Economic is not enough to solve it. Our politics and our governance is too capricious, is too irrational, illogical, and I think it's just self-serving. And we need to look at the Constitution and have a second look at our institutions of governance and whether they are fit for purpose, and whether the parliament is properly doing their work of checking the executive. Now it has just become politics, NDC, MPP, and I don't think it's helping us at all. For me, that's where I am. But when you come back to asking for law, I think my colleague was saying that we need law to regulate borrowing, and I support that. But I think that...
Do you also support a debt ceiling? Do you support a debt ceiling?
I support a debt ceiling, but I think we should start from external debt ceiling, not domestic. Because, yes, the domestic, like TBs, for example, will still be needed for short-term management. But at any point, we can set a ceiling of maybe 70% per GDP. But what has caused our problem since independence has not been over borrowing from domestic resources. When government borrow domestically, they can almost always pay it in several ways, and it's not a problem. The worst case scenario is through printing money. And that has not been, our crisis we have had has always been a balance of payment problem. It has always been our inability to raise enough foreign exchange to service our foreign exchange obligations. So that's where the problem is. It is mainly because we borrow too much externally and we don't raise enough external revenue in terms of export or revenue or remittances or foreign direct investment to service the debt. If you look at the crisis we're having now, in fact, the domestic debt exchange was almost totally unnecessary. It was because the IMF demanded it, because we needed to go to do external debt restructuring. And
so quickly on this point, you're saying we should focus in terms of a debt ceiling on the external, not local debt. But how about borrowing, for example, from the central bank? That in itself is also a thorny situation. Just addressing that, how should we approach it moving forward? Just wrap on that, and then I'll bring in Dr. Idrisu.
Okay. I'm of the view, I've spoken at length on that matter of the central bank financing. and I will write upon it again. I am of the view, you see, the textbook situation is that central bank financing or money printing leads to inflation. And I said, no, it's not true, it's a myth. And it also depends on the conditions and what the borrowing is used for. There's no country, in fact, even from Britain to the US currently, and to all the Asian countries that developed and industrialized, and the central bank did not finance massively or was not involved. So, and if you look at our records, and I can show you, if there was time, I would have shown you a graph and an analysis I've done. The causes of inflation in Ghana has not mainly been central bank financing or what they call fiscal dominance or monetary dominance. It has not been. It has mainly been because our inflation is lack of agriculture. Inflation is mainly food inflation in Ghana and mainly imported inflation. So when we failed, and I thought Dr. Abu Zakara will speak upon that because he's one of the respected people I thought when he was campaigning to become president, had some good ideas on agriculture. There's no way Ghana will develop if we don't come back to invest massively in agriculture and through agriculture to solve our food needs and to be self-sufficient in food, because that's what will control inflation. And then we will stop importing poultry and rice and many of the things, tomatoes and things that we import into this country. That is one of the first places to start our development. That's where our problem is coming from. We are using scarce resources in importing food that should have been produced in this country. We have paid lip service to agriculture. So if we got central bank, for example, to let's say give government, we have to have a bipartisan agreement. NDC, MPP, central bank, we have a National Development Planning Commission sit down. We say we will need, let's say, 10 billion Ghana cedi, 50 billion Ghana cedi to industrialize agriculture, labor-intensive agriculture. And we get that money from the central bank and we invest it into oil palm, into cocoa, into rice, into poultry. I don't see how that causes inflation. It doesn't make sense to me. If it's not going to lead to import and it's not going to be used to support the budget or to give people to buy V8 and things, and it's going to solve, food crisis problem and to industrialize the rural economy, that should actually, in the medium to long term, solve our inflation problem. It will keep inflation at less than 5-6%. And that's what Korea did. That's what Japan did. That's what Malaysia did. If you go to Malaysia, you drive through everywhere in Malaysia. In fact, when you are in the air, you will see oil palm tree all over the country. They make more money from oil palm than cocoa. In fact, they have stopped cocoa. Oil palm or palm oil is a whole factory and industry.
But again, from the developmental angle, I'll have to take you. You know why oil palm production is also in some places inhibited or controlled? Because it is sort of an invasive species, so to speak. In the sense that when people start cultivating oil palm, everything else goes. And the fear is that if you overdo oil palm, the cocoa industry, for example, could suffer. It could go under. I'm sure you're well aware of that as well, which is why the oil palm situation is a bit tricky. In those countries you reference, they have faced similar problems.
No, it's a choice. It's a development choice. They saw that oil palm is more profitable than cocoa. So they substituted oil palm for cocoa. And they have built a whole industry. In fact, if you look at just Google Malaysia and see how much export revenue they get from the oil palm sector, it's massive. It's more than we get from gold, cocoa, oil in Ghana. So there's no need for us to stick to cocoa, which is collapsing anyway. We are not investing in cocoa. What is Cocoa Board doing? How much fertilizer? What are they doing to the cocoa farmers? We have not reached our target. We can't have 2 million tons. Cocoa farmers are poor, and now they are going to, Galamsey is destroying the whole cocoa. So I don't see the argument. We need agriculture. If it's not oil palm and it's cocoa, fine. But we need to invest in cocoa, process the cocoa to make sure that we get enough export revenue from it. If it's not cocoa and it's soybean or it's whatever agricultural product, what I'm saying is that we need to solve our Greek problem. It's fundamental. A country that cannot feed itself, they have to import everything or most of the things they consume, cannot develop. And agriculture is the place to industrialize. Industrialization must be based on agro-industrialization. And it will never be private sector alone. It needs to be the risk, which means that the government needs to take the lead. The government must be entrepreneurial. It must be state that also goes in to provide. Look at loans. How can you borrow at 30, 40% to do farming? Go to my village. They take loans of almost 40%. Farmers take loans of almost 40% from the rural bank.
Right.
And then they're supposed to pay that in 1 year. Can never do that. They don't do that in the US. They don't do that in Canada. Go and check Saskatchewan. So you borrow at almost 0% or 0.5%, 1%. And then you have about 5-10 years to pay. That's how we take serious industrialization programs.
And I couldn't agree with you more, especially roping in the National Development Planning Commission. But, Dr.